Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium for Tuesday, September 7th, 2021. My name is Kenton Bird, and I'm the co-host for this weekly series of programs, along with Dan Buckovich, also on the screen with me from the Lionel Hampton School of Music. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of upcoming programs that will be of interest to the colloquium audience. Two weeks from today, on Tuesday, September 21st, the Martin Institute and Program in International Studies presents a Martin Forum with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. He will be speaking on a related topic to our colloquium today, the United States and Afghanistan 2001 to 2021. And that will be at 6:30 p.m. Live in person in the administration building auditorium. And Ambassador Crocker is no stranger. He has spent several residencies here at the University of Idaho between his 6 ambassadorships. He had retired from foreign service in April 2009 after a career of more than 37 years, but was recalled to active duty in 2011 by President Obama, and then served as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan for 2 years, from 2011 through the end of 2012. So hope you'll be able to attend that program as well. Next week in our regular colloquium time, Tuesday at 12:30, we will welcome 3 of the original humanities fellows at the University of Idaho, Professors Emeriti Gary Williams and Catherine Aiken and Professor David Lee Painter. They will be looking back at their program in 1998-99 that they're calling a retrospective look at a fantasia on diverse curricular themes. And if you were around the university in those years, you may recall that their theme was diversity and inclusion and cultural awareness, and that their culminating event was a presentation by playwright Tony Kushner. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about how diversity affected the curriculum at the University of Idaho, please join us next week. And this is one of several programs this year that commemorates the 20th anniversary of the Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. We have a YouTube channel. Several people had contacted me this morning. They were interested in our talk today, but were unable to watch it in real time. So the recordings are posted. If you just search for Renfrew Colloquium YouTube, it will bring up this panel, and the most recent programs will be at the top left. So for example, you can revisit last week's program about the origins of the Renfrew Colloquium on this page, and we'll have Professor Spence's talk posted probably later today or first thing tomorrow morning. Today, our guest is Richard Spence, a professor emeritus of history. He specializes in Russian intelligence and military history. Over his 35 years at the University of Idaho, he taught courses in modern espionage, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, the history of secret societies, and the occult in history. He is also the writer and presenter of 2 programs for the Great Courses, also known as Wondrium, The Real History of Secret Societies, and Crimes of the Century, a selective history of infamy. Today, his topic draws on the history of Asia, on military history, and Russian and intelligence history. And Professor Spence was going to tell us a little bit about the historical context for current events, Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. And I'm going to stop sharing and then allow Professor Spence to share his screen. Welcome, Rick.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So let's see if this works. There we go. Okay. So what everybody should be looking at is an ethno-linguistic map of Afghanistan, which looks a little bit like camo. And what this shows in various shades of brown and green mostly is really a kind of map of the people who actually live there. So let me start out with a couple of things. The land and people who now constitute the nation of Afghanistan have been there since, well, pretty much forever. That is the region, the mountains, the valleys, the rivers, the various tribes, the different ethnic groups, most of them coming and going, have been there for centuries or millennia. Afghanistan as a country, that is a thing that has a border drawn around it and a name on it, has only existed since 1823. I'll describe in a few minutes how that came about. But one of the interesting things about it, I'm not sure you can necessarily see it on this slide, but you'll notice below it has the different groups. And I could use my pointer here. Notice the light green. Look at these areas that are light green. Most of it's over here in the eastern part of the country, but you'll notice that there are little blobs of light green kind of all over the place, camo style. The light green areas represent the territories inhabited by the biggest and arguably the most important of the ethnic groups in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns. Pashtuns make up about 40 to 45% of the population. Nobody's exactly sure, but they're not a majority. That's a point I want to make. Afghanistan ethnically has no majority. So at best, the Pashtuns are the single biggest group. We'll also see that politically and historically, they're the most important, and we'll explain why. But the Pashtuns, you notice, are mostly in this area of the country. Kabul lies roughly in their territory, Kandahar, probably the two most important cities. And there are other little islands of Pashtuns scattered around. The next biggest group is this kind of dark brown area. And again, you'll notice that they're mostly over here, but there's some over here and here and here and here. And those are the Tajiks. The Tajiks are basically Eastern Persians. Little sidestep here. See this country to the west, Iran? I'm sure you've heard about that. Well, up until the 1930s, Iran had been for thousands of years Persia. And the predominant culture and ethnic group in Iran today are Persians, and the language is Farsi. So the Tajiks are, let's say, ethnic cousins of Persians. And the language which they speak, which is today called Dari for political reasons, is really just a dialect of Farsi. They make up about, the Tajiks that is, make up maybe 30% of the population, less than the Pashtuns, but still a significant part of the population. The Tajiks are also important culturally because probably the most widely spoken language, the kind of lingua franca of the country, at least for a long time, was Farsi, the Tajik language. And that was because it was generally identified as the language of culture. Farsi, Persian, produced a wide array of literature. On the other hand, Pashtun didn't, or at least up until the 20th century, had not produced a great deal of literature in it. So if you were going to become an educated person in Afghanistan, you would more likely be educated in Farsi. Think of it this way. It was the kind of French of Afghanistan. Then you've got other groups. You've got the Uzbeks. They're the kind of light brown group up here. The Uzbeks are a Turkic people. That is, they're linguistically and ethnically unrelated to the Pashtuns or to the Tajiks. They make up about 10% of the population, right up here along the border with a thing called Turkmenistan. Guess who lives there? Turkmen. They make up maybe 3 or 4% of the population. And then in the center, this dark green group, these are the Hazaras. And the Hazaras are historically probably the poorest, the most marginalized, the most put upon, and for the most part, the most despised by everyone else for reasons that I'm not sure would make sense to anyone outside of the environment. The Hazaras are a distinct group. A lot of them speak Farsi, but many of them trace well, what they like to do is to trace their origins to the Mongols. And there certainly is a Mongol ethnic element among the Hazaras. But the main thing that separates the Hazaras and marginalizes them among other inhabitants of Afghanistan is that they're the only significant group that are Shia Muslims. And here I have to say that Afghanistan is 99.999% Islamic. Virtually everyone there is a Muslim. And most of those, the overwhelming majority, the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, the Turkmen, the Uzbeks, are Sunni or Orthodox Muslims. Now, this is a whole other talk about something else, but as most of you are aware of, there is a schism in Islam between Sunni and Shia. It's been around for a long time. It's a serious business to many people. And because the Shia the Shia Hazara are isolated within this sort of sea of Sunnis, that's one of the things that's led them to occupy often a semi-persecuted position within the country. But there are other smaller groups, Molochs, Brahuis. Up here, this sort of orange group, those are Nuristanis. Nuristanis are, they're probably cousins of the Pashtuns. But here's the interesting thing about the Nuristanis. Up until little more than a century ago, in the 1890s, Nuristan, which basically means land of light or land of the converts, was inhabited by people who were pagans. That is, this was a mountainous region that had been so isolated, it had never been converted to Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, anything that had come through. That was changed, as we'll see, by a particular Afghan ruler in the 1890s who decided that he was going to, well, gain cred with the religious leaders in Afghanistan, the Islamic religious leaders, by forcibly converting all the Nuristanis to Sunni Islam, which he did, among other things, as we'll see. But they still constitute a separate ethnic community in that regard. All right, so those are the different peoples who live within Afghanistan. Now, you can't see all the names below, but one of the main points I want to make here is that if you look at all the ethno-linguistic groups in Afghanistan, you know what you will not find? Any group called Afghans. They're not there. There's no actual group of people identifiable that you can get together and point at called Afghans. So that raises our first mystery. Why, if there are no Afghans in Afghanistan, is the country called Afghanistan? We'll come back to that. But the other thing I want to point out are the countries around it. I already mentioned Persia, Iran. I'm going to keep calling it Persia because that's what it really is. And remember, the Persians are the very close cousins of the Tajiks, the second biggest ethnic group in Afghanistan. But then, as I've already mentioned, right up here next to the Turkmen territories are Turkmenistan, and then Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which means that all of these other groups I've mentioned, or at least most of them, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and the Turkmens, all ethnic groups in Afghanistan, have ethnic compatriots who exist in countries, well, there are countries with their names outside of it, which means that there are millions of Tajiks that live in Afghanistan. Across the border, there are millions more Tajiks that live in Tajikistan. Same thing is true for the Pashtuns, because over in the mountainous western areas of Pakistan, what years before used to be British India, but now is Pakistan, guess who lives in all of those areas along the Pakistan-Afghan border? Why, more Pashtuns. In fact, There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. And they are simply divided by this border, which we'll see was again drawn in the 1890s by the British to separate their territories from the nominally independent emirate of Afghanistan. Now, if you put all of this together, you might think it could get a little bit confusing over exactly who you are and where you belong and what your country is. And it also gives some idea as to how Afghanistan as a state is essentially a political entity without being an ethnic entity. And it's something you might also keep in mind that it's often difficult for people to develop a kind of strong allegiance to. So the question might come in this, what are you actually? So the fundamental loyalty of most people is to their family. And that often means to their clan, an extended family, a cousinhood in many ways. I mean, those are the people that you're related to. They're the people you're around every day. They're your parents, your uncles, nephews, cousins, all part of blood relations. And the clan is then, certainly if you're part of the Pashtuns, part of a tribe. Pashtuns are divided into tribes. Tribes are divided into clans. So you're loyal to your immediate family, you're loyal to your clan, you're loyal to your tribe. And if you're a Pashtun, Tajik, etc., you're loyal to your ethnic group. So being loyal to something abstractly called Afghanistan comes rather far down on the list. Now, the other thing I want you to imagine is how do you govern a country like that? Not beyond the question as to why it exists at all, but how do you govern it? So let me go back for a minute to this mystery I brought up that there are no Afghans in Afghanistan. So where did the term come from? I mean, somebody had to apply it. It's there on the map, so it has to come from somewhere. Through most of its long history, the lands that would become Afghanistan in the 19th century had mostly spent the, I don't know, maybe 3,000 years before that as off and on parts of a greater Persian empire. So here again, this is a whole other aspect of history we can't go too far into, but the Persian Empire keeps coming and going. It's a phoenix. It disappears. Alexander the Great destroyed one, another one pops up, that one disappears. And so the lands that would become Afghanistan and the peoples in those lands had for much of their history been nominally sort of on the eastern border of the Persian Empire, which will also explain why the Persian language Farsi becomes so important there. So there's all that kind of past history to it. The Persians, who lived further to the west and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what various, from their standpoint, hill people were doing off in the eastern regions, as far as anybody can tell, in other words, the best guess is that the term Afghan originated in a term which the Persians used to describe tribal peoples in the far off eastern frontier. The term is something like Avegana or Afathana. And the Persians, the only thing remembered about them was that they were apparently really good at breeding horses. Oh, and they were warlike and obnoxious. But they just sort of lived off in the eastern areas of the empire. And that seems to have been the term that came in. So what that later became, the term Afghan, became a kind of substitute term for Pashtun. It wasn't the way that Pashtuns described themselves. Pashtuns called themselves Pashtuns, but it was a term that other peoples, the Persians and other peoples around there, used to describe them, and it kind of stuck in some way. I don't know, the closest comparison, and it's not that close I could come with, is that, you know, there are people in Europe that we called Germans who don't call themselves that. You know, they're Deutsch and it's Deutschland. But nevertheless, they tend to recognize that a lot of other people tend to refer to them as Germans or Alemans or whatever the case might be. So Afghan itself is a kind of artificial term that was probably applied by someone else, generally to the Pashtuns, and later it became a term that you could sort of incorporate all the Pashtuns in without any kind of references to all of those troublesome tribal differences, because while Pashtuns were unified in being Pashtuns, tribes had feuds with each other, blood feuds, intertribal wars. All of this was a very common part, even among the Pashtun communities and others. Now, the term that this talk is titled, Afghanistan, Graveyard of Empires. It's a great title. That's why I chose it. But here again is an interesting thing. It's if you assume that Afghanistan has been called Graveyard of Empires forever, well, I'd remind you again, Afghanistan has only existed since 1823. And the term Graveyard of Empires, so far as I can tell, really didn't come into any kind of significant use until around 1999 or 2000. And it wasn't originally applied to Afghanistan. It was actually applied to the Balkans. And I actually found one other use of the term Graveyard of Empires, which again talked about the Balkans in the early 20th century. And there are a number of parallels, and it fits. And you can quibble with that term in a lot of ways. You could argue the fact that no empire has actually died in Afghanistan. Empires have involved themselves in Afghanistan. They have suffered various setbacks and disasters and occasional successes there. But very often, Afghanistan has been conquered in the past. As I said, it had been part of numerous Persian empires and others. So it's not really fair to say that empires come to Afghanistan and die. Afghanistan isn't demonstrably responsible for the death of any empire. I think about the term this way. It's not that empires die in Afghanistan, it's that the people serving the interests of those empires die in Afghanistan. The graveyard of empires are the graves of all of those soldiers, diplomats, and others who have in some way tried to play in this great game and end up buried there one way or the other. Afghanistan can and has been conquered, or at least occupied. There's a difference there. But subdued, well, that's another question. So let's look a little bit, just like a trot through Afghanistan's formation and its history. So I said the emirate of Afghanistan, not the kingdom, not the empire, the emirate, which roughly would be sort of the European equivalent of a principality. So the emirate of Afghanistan was proclaimed in 1823. But there's a little history prior to that. And to do that, let me bring up another slide. What have we got here? Let's see. See, I've even got an outline. There we go. So at the top of this, there's a kind of old saying. Okay? I don't know where this old saying comes from either. Some people say it's an Arab saying, others say it's a Persian saying. It's definitely not an Afghan saying, but it fits. And I want to read it to begin with, and you can see how this is going to echo during the rest of what I'm going to talk about. I against my brother and I against our cousin, my cousin, my brother and I against the outsider. And that, I'll suggest, is a pretty good description of Afghan politics 101.
Rick, we're not seeing your outline. I think you need to scroll down on the Word document or move to the next slide.
Let's try that one. This one. How's that one? You see it now?
Not yet. Still seeing the map.
Okay, let's get out of the map.
Do you have two screens up? Maybe you're sharing the screen that you're not expecting to be sharing.
Well, I don't know. This is what I was afraid of.
If you want,
Let me stop the share, and then
okay.
I'll do it again. And then I will. What do we got here? How's that?
There it is. Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, there we have it. Okay, I against my brother and I against our cousin, my brother and I against against the outsider. So what that basically means is that there's plenty of things for groups within Afghanistan to fight over. But the one thing that will tend to unify them is any intrusion from the outside. So I think we've talked about the different ethnic groups. So back in the 1800s, the Age of Enlightenment, the era of the American Revolution, what was going on in Afghanistan when the French and American revolutions were going on? The main thing that happened in the 18th century is that last iteration of the Persian Empire, the Safavid Empire, was collapsing. It was dying, but it wasn't dying in Afghanistan or because of it. It was just falling apart as empires do. And what that did was that as the Persian Empire collapsed, that meant that those Afghanas, those Eastern horse-breeding, warlike hill people, were now freed of whatever degree of Persian control there had been. And under their tribal warlords, they began to expand, fight among themselves, and actually began to carve out an independent state or quasi-state for themselves in what had been the eastern part of the Persian Empire. They took over. First group to do that was a tribe called the Hotaki. They had a short-lived Hotak Empire that lasted for a couple of decades. That fell apart. They were replaced by something called the Durrani Empire, which was based on another Pashtun tribe called the Durranis. And they held control really during the late 18th, early 19th century, but that would also collapse. But one of the things to notice is that both those earlier Pashtun states were simply known by the name of the tribe. Okay, there's no reference to Afghans or Pashtuns. It was the Hotaki tribe. If they conquered it, it was their empire. If it was the Durranis, it was their empire. So in 1823, another tribe takes over. The Durranis are overthrown bloodily, I might add, and replaced by the Barakzai dynasty, which is another powerful Pashtun tribe. And the fellow who was the first guy to establish himself as the head of that dynasty was Dost Muhammad Khan. He, in some ways, is the kind of daddy of Afghanistan. So Dost Muhammad Khan is the guy who, mostly for political reasons, decided that he was going to name the country Afghanistan. Now, what immediately begins to happen is that in the midst of the 19th century, you got a thing that's taken shape in Central Asia called the Great Game. And the Great Game was essentially a contest between two empires, the Tsarist Russian Empire and the British Empire. The Tsarist Russian Empire was expanding down from the north through Central Asia, and you had the British who were expanding their control over the Indian subcontinent all the way up to what would again be the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was a gradual process, but the Great Game refers to this kind of diplomatic and military chess game that these two empires had. So one of the things that they were always trying to do was to gain influence in different territories over different tribes and to subvert the other's control over territories and tribes. And that's really what coalesced Afghanistan. Because in the midst of this competition between Russia and Britain, there was also the sort of recognition that it would probably be politically expedient to have a buffer state between their two empires. So they wouldn't have the problem of sharing a common border. So there was a tacit agreement, let's say, between the imperialists in St. Petersburg and the imperialists in London, or Lahore, as you want to choose it, to allow Afghanistan to exist as they saw it, to keep it sort of weak and dependent on one side or another, but to keep it there as a buffer. And that meant, of course, trying to keep it non-aligned. So you create this buffer state, and then the two empires for the rest of the 19th century begin to vie for political influence, which keeps things, shall we say, lively. So the British in the 1830s began to push their advantage. And one of the things the British wanted to do was to establish a foothold in Afghanistan. And that meant establishing something like a political resident. That is, to bring in really a representative of the East India Company and the British Empire, who, along with a military garrison, would establish himself in Kabul, build some sort of militarized compound that would represent the influence and the power of this neighboring empire, and sort of run the country or manage it through its local ruler. Now, the problem is that Dost Muhammad was a fairly canny guy, and he realized that his best chance was to do what? What would you do? You're going to play the Russians and the British off against each other. You're going to promise them everything, but you're never going to give them quite what it is that they want. So this double dealing, as the British saw it, made them unhappy. And so there was a whole series where Dost Muhammad, the British, engineer his overthrow. They bring back a previous ruler that Dost Muhammad had overthrown, Shah Shuja. He proves to be unpopular for a number of reasons, mostly because Shah Shuja had this thing about, he had a bad temper apparently, and one of the things he would do if something went wrong, like PowerPoint not working, is that he would cut people's noses and fingers or genitals or toes off. One of the British resident noticed was that almost all of Shah Shuja's servants were missing parts of their anatomy. Nobody had all their ears. No one had lips. And that was, nevertheless, his servants seemed to be quite loyal to him. But Shah Shuja was then sort of installed by the British. The British invade Afghanistan. They march into Kabul. They bring a small army of British officers, Indian troops, set up the residency, put their guy on the throne. And what happens? There's a rebellion. The old term, all hell breaks loose, and it did. There was a rebellion that spread across the country. The foreigners have come in. A new sort of hero arose, Dost Muhammad's son, Akbar Khan, who proved to be a fairly effective military leader. And what happened was that the British eventually find themselves in an untenable situation and decide they're going to retreat from Kabul. They're going to withdraw. Remember, this isn't an empire dying, but the British Empire was going to take a step back. And they were given assurances, they believed, that the diplomats, the 5,000 or so British and Indian soldiers, and the 12 to 15,000 camp followers, mostly the families of the Indian soldiers, were all going to be allowed to evacuate Kabul. Any of that sound vaguely familiar? This is the evacuation of Kabul. Now, they're not going to do it by plane. They're going to have to march out and walk overland through the Khyber Pass. By the way, this is also in the winter. This is taking place basically in January 1842, but they thought they had been given guarantees. But this is one of the things about if the ruler in Kabul gives a guarantee, that guarantee doesn't necessarily obligate the tribal leaders or his tribesmen on the way out. And what happened in the retreat from Kabul is that whole retreating force, the 5,000 soldiers, the 12 to 15,000 camp followers, the British diplomats, were massacred virtually to a man and woman. There were only a handful of survivors who came through the whole thing. It was one of the great military defeats of British arms in the 19th century. Now, again, it didn't destroy the empire. It's not going to stop the British from scheming more into Afghanistan, but it was a step back. And one of the things that also suggested the British and the others was just how unmanageable this place in many ways seemed to be. So one of the things this did is it restored Dost Muhammad to the throne, and then over the next couple of decades, there was more Russian intrigue, more British intrigue, more emirs came and went, and that then led to a second Anglo-Afghan war. So the British come back. They just wait a few decades, and now they come back, and once again, they instigate the overthrow of a ruler that they felt was too close to the Russians, put their particular fellow on the throne, which then started a generalized rebellion, which the Russians were happy to arm and equip. And that led to the Second Anglo-Afghan War, in which the British suffered setbacks, but again were eventually able to march in and occupy Kabul and occupy Kandahar and force the Afghans, or rather force the emir that they had put on the throne, their puppet, I suppose we could call him. They forced him to sign a Treaty of Gandamak. And the Treaty of Gandamak gave complete control of Afghanistan's foreign affairs to the British Raj in India. It meant that if you were a foreigner, you couldn't even go into Afghanistan without getting approval from the British first. And the British residency was returned to Kabul, a small garrison, much smaller this time, only 75 Indian soldiers and a few British officers were sent in. By the way, that didn't work out well either, because in the midst of the rebellion, the new British resident, Sir Louis Cavagnari, and all but 7 of his supporting soldiers were attacked and massacred in the midst of this rebellion. So another group of Brits were killed in Kabul. They didn't even get a chance to retreat. But in the end, the Second Anglo-Afghan War established, it appeared to be, a kind of British predominance over Afghanistan. Now, that's where a few years later, in 1893, the British again drew up a border. They went along. It wasn't the Afghans who did this, by the way. It was the British who essentially determined what the border was going to be through all of these Pashtun lands, which quite, by the way, strategically divided the Pashtun tribes between areas of British control and those nominally under the Afghan state, the sort of client state, which the British have now created. The Afghans were never happy about this, and they had no choice in it. And it's no Afghan government up to the present time has ever accepted the Durand Line as the definitive legitimate border, because remember, there are all of those Pashtuns on the other side. Now, something else that sort of aided the British during this period was that in the latter part of the 19th century, Afghanistan seemed to go through a period of stability. The establishment of British dominance seemed to make things a bit more stable. And that brought in a fellow by the name of Abdur-Rahman Khan, the new emir. Abdur-Rahman Khan was on the throne from around 1880, when the British installed him, until his death in 1901. So he's around for the better part of 20 years. And during those 20 years, well, there were all kinds of rebellions. There's always a rebellion somewhere in the country, but he was able to defeat them. But Abdur-Rahman Khan set a particular example. His nickname was the Iron Emir. And he didn't get that nickname because he was a particularly benevolent ruler. He's the guy, for instance, who marched into Nuristan and forcibly converted all the pagans. He's also the guy who, every time he suppressed a rebellious Pashtun tribe, he would resettle them. He would forcibly relocate them to another area of the country. So remember that map I showed you earlier, and I pointed out those blobs, those islands of Pashtuns? Well, that's essentially thanks to Abdur-Rahman Khan. He would defeat tribes, and then one of the ways of sort of subjugating them or dividing them from others was to send them off into another part of the country, which also served his purpose of divide and conquer by plopping down a lot of Pashtuns in the midst of a lot of Tajiks, knowing that they would not get along. But it was a way of playing them off against each other, which he did fairly successfully. A couple of other little interesting statistics. During his 20 years in power, Abdurrahman Khan signed 102,000 political execution orders. He also periodically savaged the Hazaras, the Shiite group, which seemed to offend everybody else, and carried out, in some cases, wholesale massacres. So this is the point. He created 20 years of relative stability, but if you look closely, you can see how that was achieved. It's also a reason his reign probably did much to convince a lot of people in various parts of the country was that a strong central government was the last thing you ever wanted to have. Because look at all the wonderful things that strong central governments did. Now, Abdurrahman Khan was followed by Habibullah Khan. And Habibullah Khan, again, was on the throne for around 20 years, up until 1919. Habibullah Khan, unlike his dad, was relatively easygoing. He actually carried out a few limited reforms, didn't have a lot of people executed. His limited reforms included creating some elite schools to try to train a national elite. After he was living in the 20th century, realized that he needed educated Afghans to be able to do modern things, operate machinery, run railroads, officer his new style army. So Habibullah's reign was relatively stable, although there were the usual number of rebellions happening all the time in some part of the country. But he was assassinated. I might also say that Habibullah Khan was one of his single greatest achievement was keeping Afghanistan out of World War I, which the Germans and the Turks were constantly trying to bribe him to do. I mean, they would really like it if the Afghans attacked the Indian frontier. Habibullah Khan pretty sensibly, let's say, came to the idea that while the Germans and the Turks might egg him on, there was really nothing they could do to support him in a war against the British, so he stayed out. So is he assassinated in 1919 because he didn't enter the war? No, he's assassinated because his youngest son, Amanullah Khan, wanted the throne and dad was in the way. Therefore, the general supposition today is that it was Amanullah who bribed or otherwise persuaded one of his father's servants to stab him in the middle of the night while they were on a camping trip. Now, then Habibullah was, as he was supposed to be, was succeeded by his brother, Nasrullah Khan, whose son, Amanullah, immediately came in and overthrew. So to make things simple without going through a lot of names, a father had his son assassinated so he could take the throne, and that ushered in the glorious reign of Amanullah Khan, who did see himself as a reformer. And one of the things that he did was to relieve many of the restrictions on women, especially revising the dress code so that women were not have to be fully covered when they went out. He built more schools. He brought in more foreign experts. He also tried to actually collect taxes and also to replace local warlords with his own appointed governors. See, the way that previous emirs kept peace was that you always made the governor of a province the most important tribal warlord in the province, not send out one of your own people. So Amanullah carried out reforms. He also managed to make a lot of enemies in the process of that. And he also now was still sort of wooed by the British and then wooed by the Russians. And oh, by the way, the Russians at this point have changed, haven't they? Now they've become the Bolsheviks, who would, of course, Bolsheviks are all for reform. So they were willing to send in military advisors. You ever wonder when the first Soviet military advisors showed up? During the reign of Amanullah. The other thing, possibly to some degree under Bolshevik influence was that Amanullah, as soon as he got on the throne, he instigated another war with the British, and we get the Third Anglo-Afghan War. His grand desire was to reconquer all of the various lands that had been available, on the other side of the Durand Line. He did not exceed in doing that. He actually, the British again march in, occupy Kabul. They don't keep it. They don't want to go back into Kabul again or hang around there any amount of time. So, but he does win something. That Treaty of Gandamak that gave control of Afghans' foreign affairs to the British, that is rescinded. And Afghanistan, in a sense, regains its independence. So he starts a war, militarily loses it, but diplomatically actually gets something out of it. Well, more things. What will eventually happen to the glorious reign of Amanullah oh, by the way, he's also the guy who in 1926 promotes himself to king. Can't just be an emir anymore. He's now a king, and it becomes the Kingdom of Afghanistan. He is overthrown in 1929. Civil war results. The British and the Soviets both try to exploit that. It leads to a chaotic situation in which at one point Kabul is captured by a bandit, the kind of Pancho Villa of Afghanistan, who is briefly the ruler before he's overthrown, horribly tortured and executed. And then another fellow comes in as emir and he's overthrown. And eventually you end up with a fellow who had been Amanullah's army commander and his cousin, by the way, a fellow by the name of Nadir Khan. He puts the country back into order, and then he's assassinated in 1933. By the way, by a high school student at a high school which he had formed at a graduation ceremony. What then follows is the 40-year reign, and surprisingly peacefully unruffled reign, of Muhammad Zahir Shah. And by this time, you might be trying to wonder, how does anybody stay on the throne for 40 years? Well, he does that for the first 30 years of not ruling at all, of letting his elder uncles as prime ministers govern the country for him. Therefore, he never makes any enemies because he never really does anything. But then in the 1960s, Muhammad Zahir Shah did start doing things. He introduced a constitution, which then created a parliament and was going to legalize political parties and labor unions. And that's where he started to get into trouble. That's where there were some issues that were involved. And one of the things that came out of this was the formation of something called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Allow political parties, and they are going to get political parties. Any guesses what the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan actually was? It was the Communist Party. And to no great extent, no great surprise, the Soviets were pretty big backers of the Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And from there, well, I'm just going to work, so we'll have some time for questions. I'll move it up to the present time. What began to happen? In 1973, an ambitious military officer, who was also the king's cousin, General Muhammad Daoud Khan, with Soviet backing, carried out a military coup and took over the country and proclaimed it a republic. He then began to place into positions of power members of that People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, who had ambitions of their own. In 1978, communist officers carried out the so-called Sour Revolution, in which they overthrew General Daoud Khan, killed him, his entire family, and much of what remained of the royal family. But they were divided. The communists were split into two factions. It's like Stalinists and Trotskyites, and they're going to argue over it and kill each other. And they have the Kholk and the Parcham factions, and so they begin to fight. Their attempts at reform, which including things like collectivization of land, what did that create? A generalized rebellion. The rebellion begins to get out of hand. The Soviets have to intervene. At one point, kill the guy that they had installed and install someone else, and then overthrow him. And that leads to, well, the Soviet War, the next 10 years, where you got the Soviets, the Red Empire, battling the Mujahideen, backed by the CIA. And then Gorbachev in 1989 pulls the Soviets out. He's had enough. He leaves, just like the British had done before. And does that lead to a peaceful solution? No. The Mujahideen gang up on what remains of the communist regime, overthrow that, and then they start fighting among themselves. And it's out of that chaotic civil war in the 1990s that a group of religious students trained and paid by the Pakistani military and intelligence services, called the Taliban, the students, enter this civil war, and with a lot of Pakistani military backing, in 1996, capture Kabul and most of the country and proclaim the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. And then comes 2001 and the American invasion and the next 20 years. And that, of course, has brought us recently to simply the most recent evacuation from Kabul. And I'll end things there for any questions.
Thank you for that informative sweep across the last 2.5 centuries of Afghanistan history. We did have a question in the chat earlier from Bob, who was wondering if you could tell us why and how Kabul was chosen as the capital, and why has it remained the capital through all these different empires attempting to bring Afghanistan under their control?
Well, there actually were originally 2 capitals in Afghanistan. This is back before the Durand Line. There was Kabul, which was the summer capital, and then there was Peshawar, which is in Pakistan today, which was the winter capital. And that was because, one was warmer and one was cooler. And that again suggests why Afghans don't necessarily see that border as the real border, because for a while, Peshawar, which is now in Pakistan, was in fact one of the capitals of the country. So Kabul was only one of 2 capitals, but it became, and once Peshawar was gone, it was the only one left. But the other explanation for it is that Kabul lies along a major trade route from Central Asia to India. If you look at a map, you'll notice its proximity to the Khyber Pass, which is the main place that trade flows through. It sits on a river, which meant there was a constant supply of water. It had a nice fortified hill. It has a huge fort, the Bala Hissar, which overlooks the place. So it was well watered. There were agricultural areas around it. It was on a major trade route, and Kabul very early on. I mean, it's why today it's the closest thing you have to a kind of. It's the real sort of modern cosmopolitan city, and it's not like the rest of Afghanistan. I mean, it's the one place where if there was ever foreign influence, it would be in Kabul, because that's where foreigners would come. Another statistic I can throw at you is that even today, 20% of the Afghan population is urban, 80% is rural. Most people live in relatively remote rural areas in villages.
Other questions from the audience?
Lisa.
Hey, Richard, great talk. So if I'm going to be a political scientist, and I'm going to predict the future.
Okay.
So the Taliban's going to take over now. And what overthrows this group next? I mean, because what I'm understanding from you, Richard, is the trajectory is has a history of political violence and a history of internal rebellion. So what stops that dynamic, or what doesn't stop that dynamic?
Nothing stops it.
Okay.
Why would it stop? I mean, the problem.
Well, that's my question, Richard.
Well, if you go back to that period between 1996 and 2001, when the Taliban were in control, and you look closely, you realize they never actually controlled the whole country. There was
Okay.
always this mostly Tajik resistance, which was going on in the north. There was a thing called the Northern Alliance
Yeah.
that kept on fighting. It was a thing that some people recently were trying to rekindle in the Panjshir Valley. And it looks like the new Taliban have crushed that. But I mean, if you look at the gist of what I was saying, and there are a lot more details in it, is that it's one thing to take control of Kabul. Every emir,
Right.
every king, every
Right.
every commie has taken control of Kabul, but that doesn't mean you control all those villages.
Right.
It creates the illusion that you control it. But when you actually go out and try to impose control, tell people what to do, or heaven forbid, collect taxes from them, or tell them that they have to stop what they've been doing for the last 2,000 years and do something else. The big challenge for the Taliban, let's see if they can match. The big challenge for the Taliban will be the same challenge for every Afghan ruler that we've talked about, actually governing the country. And that will be a challenge. The other thing they have are factional disputes within. Remember, the Taliban were unified in overthrowing the present regime. Remember?
Yeah.
It's the outsider. Now the outsiders are gone. So
Right.
there are no more, nasty Americans and their satellites around doing this. You've
Right.
gotten rid of your enemies. Who else are you going to fight except each other? So
Right.
that's one of the things to look for, factional disputes. And you know that's going to happen if they start purging each other.
It's the Trotskyite Stalinist thing.
Yeah, well, that's when the communists took control. They could, one of their constant problems is they were always fighting with each other.
Right.
And so maybe the Taliban will be different, but you would take.
Well, but again, at what human cost?
Yeah.
So
Anything?
Rick, I have a military strategy question. Obviously, whatever the United States military strategy was, it changed under the four different presidents over the last 20 years. But what essentially did we do wrong? I mean, would there have been any way that we could have set out to establish order and create a democracy and keep terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as its base, or was it a lost cause to begin with?
If you wanted to put in 1 million troops and permanent occupation, if you wanted to scour the entire country and kill a lot of people, which was what would be necessary because you're dealing with people who otherwise will not give up, then you could have pacified it as long as you were willing to make that kind of investment. But my opinion, and it's purely opinion, is that it was a fool's errand to begin with. And there wasn't anything that you were going to achieve to the extent that you're willing to. The question comes down to how much blood and treasure do you want to expend?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
So,
Lisa, go ahead if you'd like to respond.
No, that's interesting. It strikes me as that's very analogous to Vietnam. I mean, we could have won with nuclear weapons, but then what do we win?
well, the only thing the Taliban had to do, and I guess this is kind of like the Viet Cong, is, and they always knew this. Remember, they're home. Okay,
Yeah, they have home turf.
They don't have any other place to go.
Right.
And it's they just have to wait. And sooner or later, people who come from somewhere else, who have no particular roots there, who are barricading themselves behind blast walls and barbed wire. I mean, that was the type of thing that would always tell you something. If you go around the place and you look at the relatively calm situations in Kabul, you notice the place that wherever Americans or other foreigners congregated, they surrounded themselves with blast walls and barbed wire. What does that tell you? That you don't feel safe the minute you go outside the blast walls and the barbed wire. And that never changed. Right? We created military bases, airfields, we surrounded everything with blast walls and barbed wire, and we garrisoned those places. And, you'd kind of go out and patrol the area and shoot some places up and say you pacified it. Then you'd go back behind the barbed wire, and it was exactly the way it was before you went out.
Mm-hmm.
You hunkered down for what? Okay, and the hunkering down, it created, my argument would be, the illusion of pacifying a country that you never even made any kind of damned effort to pacify. Because you were the thing that, your very presence was what was stimulating this kind of resistance. And that's what I meant by the fact that once the Taliban don't have a foreign occupying force to be a focus, how's that going to work?
Yeah.
We have 3 excellent questions in the chat, and normally we would wrap up here at 1:30, but Professor Spence, if you're willing to do Q&A for another 10 minutes or so.
For 5 or 10 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And we have, if you need to leave for another commitment, that's fine. So a quick one from Taylor, who is asking, is the Taliban ethnically diverse, or is it comprised of any majority ethnic group?
In its original iteration back in the 90s, it was, as far as I can tell, overwhelmingly Pashtun. It doesn't seem to be quite as Pashtun-centric as it was. And that's the other thing that isn't really clear to me, is that in this 20-year gap, and what's happened over that period of time, as the Taliban, it has some of the same leaders, it also has different people in it. The original Taliban was based among the Pashtuns. It was really sort of recruited initially between Afghan Pashtun refugees in Pakistan. That's where it originated. And it had problems winning the loyalty and support of groups like the Tajiks. And for instance, much of the Northern Alliance, most of that group that between 1996 and 2001 resisted the Taliban was Tajik based. The Hazaras also have, you're going to get no love from the Taliban. Don't expect that they're not going to be happy about. So that's another resistance group you would have. But one of the things I noticed this time is that unexpectedly, the Taliban's first gains, the area where it was making a lot of military and territorial gains, was in the north. And the north of the country is predominantly non-Pashtun. That's where Uzbeks and Tajiks and other groups predominate. And I've seen some people argue that's because the Taliban was much more effective in recruiting Uzbeks and Tajiks into the movement that it was. And remember, religion is something that the Taliban are based around. Their whole idea, what they're selling that on, isn't that we're Pashtuns, but that we are genuine Orthodox Muslims who want to create an Islamic state under Sharia law for all Muslims. And that's one of the things to keep in mind in this situation, why religion is so important, because it's the only thing, with the exception of the Hazaras, that can unify these groups. It's the one thing that they can all ostensibly agree on. So I hazard a guess that the present Taliban is somewhat more diverse than the earlier one, but let's see if that holds together. I'm not positive it will.
We have a question from Becca, who is referring back to your chronology of events, and she's wondering, how did the elders maintain a 40-year peace during the reign of King Muhammad Zahir Shah? And could the people of Afghanistan today be led back to that type of government structure with respected elders as chiefs or a council of chiefs?
Well, keep in mind, the one thing that probably kept Zahir Shah on the throne as long as he was is not doing anything. Okay, remember, for 30 of his 40 years, he really didn't involve himself in politics, or, I mean, there were he was very gradual reforms. And really, he would get money. Who was going to give him money in this period? Both the Americans and the Soviets, because again, both of them were always trying to curry favor. And actually, he tended to bring in Soviet engineers and experts to do a lot of building up of infrastructure in the country. But here's actually, the question raises an interesting point. Zahir Shah went into exile. He went to Italy. When he was overthrown in 1973, he went to Italy and lived there. And in 2001, he's still alive. He's still living in Italy. You know, when the Americans came in and took Kabul and occupied the major cities. And he flies back into Kabul in 2002. And there was a tribal assembly. There was this sort of traditional assembly called a Loya Jirga. This was a type of thing where the tribal leaders, the elders, the mullahs would get together and make decisions. Not exactly a parliament, but a kind of tribal assembly. And what they said, yeah, what we'd like to do is to bring him back as king, restore the monarchy. Because, you know, before, you know, as long as he was there, up until, if you were looking back at it, you know, from, that was sort of the good times. Everything went to hell in a handbasket after he was overthrown in 73. So why not bring him back? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll return to the throne. Who vetoed that idea? The US did. They would have no part of it. They were not going to restore a monarchy. They were going to create a Republic of Afghanistan, which they did in 2004, as, by the way, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So keep in mind, even the government under the American aegis described itself as an Islamic government, maybe not as strictly as Islamic as the Taliban, but really nobody's arguing as to whether or not Afghanistan is going to have an Islamic government, just what form of Islam that's going to be.
I think we'll wrap up with two questions about infrastructure. One from Brett asking about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Would that be influential and maybe promoting progress from the bottom up? And then Professor Conlon Khan is asking if the United States had put more time and money into infrastructure after we assisted the Mujahideen in defeating the Soviets. Would that have made a difference? And didn't the population feel that we had abandoned them after leading to the ouster of the Soviets, but really not stepping in afterwards in any constructive way? So you can take those in either order.
Well, I don't know, I guess the question would be, is the solution to the country building more roads? You know, the US or power plants. There's an interesting episode on Vice TV, Vice News, which actually go over the construction of a huge power plant. One of the things the Americans built was a big electrical generating plant, which I don't know, spent a few billion dollars on, and which didn't actually manage to produce much of anything. And the degree to which it did produce electricity, it was controlled by the Taliban.
Yeah, it was pretty much like perfect swimming weather. Like a little chilly at one point, but that was mostly.
Sorry, we've got someone in the meeting with their microphone on. If you could, I went ahead and muted everyone I could see, so you should be okay, Rick, to finish that answer.
Well, you know, we're in the stage with Afghanistan now from the American standpoint of Monday morning quarterback and trying to go back to all the things that you could have done or that you could have should not done. You know, I don't know that greater infrastructure itself would have, you still got this situation, you would get a country which is 20% urban and 80% rural. And while the construction of more roads, more communications, more schools, more hospitals, all of those things would have been a great benefit to the population, it would often come down as to who was going to control them, whether those would be controlled centrally or whether those would be controlled elsewhere. I'd leave you with a description I got from a fellow who was in an aid development program in Afghanistan back around after 2001. And one of the things they wanted to do for the village, or for the villages in that area, was to bring in clean water, because the only source of water was a rather contaminated stream, which sewage went into and animals pooped in. So what they were going to do initially is they were going to use helicopters, and they were going to bring in pallets, huge pallets full of bottled water, so people would have clean water. So the helicopter would come in, it would drop these pallets down with all these plastic wrapped bottles of water. And then he would sort of wait around and watch what would happen. And as soon as the stuff was there, the local boss, the local tribal boss and his gunmen, the local warlord and his gun thug showed up, and they didn't take the water. No, they took the water off the wooden pallets, and they carried all the wooden pallets off. Why? Because the wooden pallets were made of sawn pieces of wood that are valuable. There wasn't a lot of wood in that area, and wood is used to build things, so they were going to take it. So then you had a lot of plastic water bottles just sitting out there, and then you would have other people, come, the next sort of group that would come, and they would take the plastic wrap off the bottles, dump the bottles on the ground, take the plastic wrap, because that was useful for wrapping things and insulation. Then eventually the village women would come out, open the bottles, pour the water out, so they would have the plastic bottles as containers. And he watched this happen over and over again. Nobody wanted the water that came in the bottles because the description was it tasted funny. And he also keep in mind that they've been drinking the local water for a long time, and it didn't seem to make anybody else sick, just him and his co-workers who got deathly ill. But it was, this isn't to present that people were being foolish or stupid or anything. It made perfect sense from what they needed. And this to me was the example of it. What the people there didn't actually need was bottled water. They didn't ask for it. They didn't need it. They had a source of water that, while it looked icky to outsiders, was perfectly adequate to their needs. On the other hand, you were giving them stuff that you thought was useless, that you would throw away. Plastic wrap, bottles that you can carry other things in, and all that nifty wood that the warlord would carry off. And that, to me, is one of these things, this kind of disconnect between what we think they want, what we think they need, what we can do for them, and what they think they want and what they think they need.
And I think that's probably a parable for the entire U.S. involvement over the last 20 years. And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that point, but I hope that everyone can attend the talk by Ambassador Ryan Crocker 2 weeks from today. That's on September 21st, 6:30 p.m. in the Administration Building Auditorium. I hope that if you have friends or classmates who were unable to join today, that you can encourage them to watch the YouTube recording, which will be up later today or first thing tomorrow morning. But before we let everyone go, I'm hoping that those of you that are remaining could still either turn on your camera or put up a hand and do a round of applause for this very timely and important presentation. So thank you, Professor Spence. And even though you've stepped out of the classroom, you haven't lost your touch. So we're grateful to have you with us today. And I hope to see our regular attendees next week for the presentation by Humanities Fellows Gary Williams, David Lee Painter, and Catherine Aiken. Have a good rest of the week, and look forward to seeing everybody at a future Renfrew Colloquium.
Thanks.